Good afternoon and welcome to our August members meeting. I'm Rick Meredith, the president of Capital Crimes. We are so pleased to have Richard Harpootlian discussing his book, Facing Evil, the writing and haunting story of a serial killer. Paula Benson will introduce Richard, but before we begin, let me detail some of our upcoming events. On Tuesday, September 8th, our Meet the Author guest will be Dwight Holling discussing his new book, The Yellow Hair, with Jennifer Marita doing the interview. And on Saturday, September 13th, we have a crime time get-together at Crawford's Books in Sacramento, and I'll host that event. On Saturday, September 19th, our guest speaker at our members meeting will be Krista Sopka of the Blue Cottage Agency to discuss creating a killer author brand. And our member Carl Henwood is hosting a weekend writing retreat at his scenic Henwood Ranch from the 8th to the 11th of October. Check the rap sheet for registration information and for our full calendar of events. Let me ask you at this point to mute your audio and turn off the video during the presentation. If you miss something, we will be recording Richard's interview and it'll be on our YouTube channel in about a week. And if you have any questions, please put them in chat and we'll cover them at the Q&A at the end. And for those new to Capital Crimes, Paula Gail Benson has been a board member for the past 5 years. She's been instrumental in bridging the coast. Last year, she moderated our Crime-a-thon East versus West competition between authors from the Palmetto chapter in South Carolina and Capital Crimes. And it's Paula's influence that lured Richard to our meeting today. Paula is a legislative attorney and former law librarian. Her 30-plus short stories have appeared online in electronic and print anthologies. In Killer Nashville Noir, Cold-Blooded, she co-authored A Matter of Honor with New York Times best-selling thriller writer Robert Dugoni. In addition to short stories, she writes and directs one-act plays and musicals for her church's drama ministry and regularly blogs with others about writing mysteries and romances in The Stiletto Gang and Writers Who Kill. Her article on how to promote short stories in Promophobia, Taking Mystery Out of Promoting Crime Fiction, a Sisters in Crime publication, won the Agatha Award for Best Nonfiction. She is honored to have received the Southeastern Chapter of Mystery Writers of America Magnolia Award, and she serves on the board of Capital Crimes. With that, Paula, let me put the spotlight on you and Richard, and thank you very much for arranging this.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, Karen, for your kind comment. It's been a great pleasure to serve on the board of Capital Crimes and get to meet all the great writers on the West Coast. It's been wonderful. And today I'm just very excited to get to introduce you to an incredible human being, Richard Harpootlian. He's a graduate of Clemson University and of the University of South Carolina School of Law. He has served as a chief homicide prosecutor, personally prosecuting hundreds of murder cases, including 12 death penalty cases. He was elected solicitor for Richland and Kershaw Counties. He also served on the Richland County Council. And during the time period that he served on the Richland County Council, he kindly reminded me today, the initiative was put forth to build a brand new main library as well as branch libraries. We now have a state-of-the-art library in our downtown Columbia and fabulous branch libraries, which are a great legacy that he and his board members have given to us. His book is Dig Me a Grave, the inside story of the serial killer who seduced the South. And it is written with Shaun Assael, and it is about a man called Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, who during the time that I was growing up, his name struck fear in people's hearts in South Carolina. Gaskins was known to have killed dozens of people, but he claimed to have killed hundreds, including some of his own family. And indeed, if you read the acknowledgement at the beginning of Dig Me a Grave, you'll see it's to Kate. That is to, I'll still say Senator Harpootlian, Senator Harpootlian's daughter, who was one of the people that Pee Wee Gaskins threatened. I have a wonderful memory of Kate and her father. And again, to show you what an advocate he has been, not only in the courtroom, but for literacy. He and his daughter's picture was on the food court in our mall whenever she was just a little girl, and he was reading to her. And that picture, he reminded me, was on billboards and other documentation throughout Columbia. And so he's been a long supporter of reading and of understanding. You know, I hope that you'll all have a chance to read Dig Me a Grave, because it not only shows you the personality of this notorious, this killer that honestly you can't understand, but it shows you the personality and the capabilities of Senator Harpootlian. Senator Harpootlian has always identified the truth and responded in the way that he feels is best to do so, even whenever it has not always been to his benefit. And I can say that, having worked with him and known times whenever he pushed the truth, even whenever it was not to his benefit. If you're in trouble, he's the kind of person you'd want to be standing there defending you. If you're a victim, he's the kind of person that you would want to be prosecuting the case. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Senator Richard A. Harpootlian, now author Richard A. Harpootlian.
You know, Paul, I can't thank you and this, can't thank you enough. Paul and I worked together for 6 years. I was elected a senator in 2018. And for the next 6 years, she was an extraordinary resource, and her advice and counsel on legislation and legal matters made my service more effective and more enjoyable. You know, I've had a career where I've been on county councils, and I was the elected DA here, and I was the deputy DA for a while. I've been in the state Senate. I was head of one of the Democratic Party here. So I've participated in public life over the last 50 years in a number of different capacities. I've prosecuted a number of death penalty cases and homicide cases. I've actually argued a death penalty case for the prosecution of a guy convicted of being a serial rapist and murderer in front of the United States Supreme Court. I've wrestled with extraordinarily complex legal issues and emotional and factual issues. I've also defended 2 death penalty cases. And let me get this out at the front end before we talk about the book. I'm a lawyer. You know, I'm not a partisan on the issue of guilt or innocence. If you're a prosecutor, your job is to see that justice is done, not just to get a conviction. If you're a defense attorney, your duty is to represent your client to the best of your ability. And in both instances, there are guardrails, ethical guardrails. And if you abide by those, then you're doing your job. There's a great book that's out, several years old, by Dan Abrams called The Last Trial of Abraham Lincoln. And most people don't realize that Abraham Lincoln was a very accomplished attorney before he became president. He prosecuted cases, he defended cases, he sued the railroads, he represented the railroads. He was the true idea, in my opinion, of being a lawyer. They're not, you know, you don't necessarily represent interests or causes or people that you agree with. You do your job. And so I'm very proud of the fact, you know, I got a little client right now that's getting some attention, a guy named Murdaugh. And typically I get emails and hate mail and how can you represent this guy and what, you know, you're despicable, or I hope you die of cancer, those kinds of things. Those people are juvenile miscreants who don't understand our wonderful system of justice. Now, there are problems in this system, but it is the best, in my opinion, in the world. Now, having given you that preface about where I stand on overall issues, let me talk a little bit about how I got to where I wrote this book or wanted to write this book, having prosecuted hundreds of cases and several death penalty cases prior to meeting Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, all I knew about him was that he pled guilty to 13 murders in the mid-70s in Florence, South Carolina, which is in what we call the PD. Paul and I are sitting in Columbia, which is the capital city in the middle of the state. If you go to the coast, you're going to go to Charleston or Hilton Head or Myrtle Beach. And the PD is about halfway between here and there. It's a sort of a scrub pine, sandy soiled, over the years, especially after the Civil War, extraordinarily impoverished. The I-95, which cuts through the middle of it, has been called, in terms of providing educational resources for kids, the corridor of shame. So it's been just a very tough, poor place to live. Not today; it's much better today. But back in the 70s, 60s, and even before, it was very, very poor. But I'd heard about Gaskins. I didn't participate in his prosecution in the 70s. But in 1982, I was the deputy solicitor, primarily prosecuted homicide cases, and got a call from the Department of Corrections, CCI, Central Correctional Institution, a prison that the first wing of it was built in 1848. General Sherman, when he came through and burned Columbia to the ground like Atlanta, housed his horses there. That cell block was still in use in 1982, along with other cell blocks that were built anywhere from the late 1800s up until 1925 or so. And we got word that an inmate on death row, a guy named Rudolph Tyner, had tried to fashion some explosive out of a match heads and tried to blow his way out of death row, and in the process killed himself. And that was sort of an interesting, story. I mean, foolish, stupid, but I mean, most of the folks on death row didn't have high IQs. But the next day I got a call from a guy named Al Waters, who was the chief investigator at the Department of Corrections. He said, look, there's something not right here. The explosion was too powerful. And an initial analysis done by a criminal lab is that it was C4, military grade plastic explosive. Well, obviously everybody began to wonder how you smuggle about a quarter of a pound of it, apparently, C4 plastic explosive into the most secure facility, the most secure wing of the most secure facility in the state. And so he began an investigation and determined that there were rumors this guy, Gaskins, who had been appointed the building man. He was the head trustee of this cell block with death row and had access to he appointed all the other trustees and had access to virtually every crevice of the cell block. He was an electrician, plumber, so he did all the repair work there. Waters went to Gaskins' cell, had him stripped naked and moved him to another cell, and then searched the cell and found 35 cassette tapes and listened to all of them. And there's about 20 minutes of that almost 35 hours of tapes in which Gaskins is talking to the dead death row inmate Rudolph Tyner's victim's son, a guy named Tony Simo, in which Simo and Gaskins are plotting to first poison and then blow up Tyner on tape, laughing about it. So that gave us the break, obviously, to indict and arrest and indict Gaskins. I want to let you know that this case, unlike all the other murder cases I ever prosecuted, I had began, and it wasn't, I didn't establish this, but Gaskins was this very personable, very interesting guy, short, 5'1", very wiry, but was hail fellow, well met to just about everybody. And everybody in his area of the state knew him. He was a roofer, he was a mechanic. Judges knew him. He put a roof on one of the judges over there's house. So, but he was very gregarious and very friendly. And so when he walked into that courtroom the first time, shackled, handcuffed, he looked over at me with a little flick of his finger and said, "Hey, Dick, how you doing?" I mean, I've never had a defendant ever addressed me personally and reflexively, being the Southern gentleman I am, said, "Okay, Pee Wee, how about you?" And so during this trial, and the trial took 6 weeks, during this process, he would oftentimes talk to me. And I felt that he was, I mean, knowing he'd killed 13 people, including a pregnant woman and her child, I knew the evil that was in him. But at the same time, I mean, here's a human being that, not sitting over there in the corner in most homicide cases, not saying a word unless they took the stand, but engaging me. And I'll talk about one of those episodes in just a minute. It's in the book. But I want to give you some sense of just how evil this guy was, and by reading to you the prologue of this book. It's only about 5 minutes. June 1973. The toddler looked up at the funny-looking man and smiled. He was short and wiry, with a voice so high and reedy that she couldn't help but giggle when he cooed, "Now, honey, stay still." Minutes before, the funny-looking man had killed her mother outside his trailer. He pressed the end of his Beretta into the nape of her neck and pushed her head first into a fish pond, using all his strength to keep her underwater. The dead woman was typical of the women he surrounded himself with. Runaways who were chasing freedom but ended up abused, broke, and pregnant. Invariably, they drifted to low-paying jobs at the carnival in South Carolina, where he befriended them. Listening to their stories, he invited them to stay with him until they were able to get their feet back on the ground. The girls became like family, his family, and the rules were simple. There would be no drugs, no asking questions about what he did when he disappeared for days. Most importantly, they had to respect themselves and the society they were born into. He once loved the woman outside, but the baby she was carrying, just like her first child, had a father who was black. And the way he figured it, hell, son, there had to be some price to pay for that. He ran his hand through the slicked back hair, wet from the summer's relentless humidity, and walked back into his trailer. The toddler was exactly where he left her, on the couch. Her mother met her father in the carnival midway and tried to keep her a secret. But when she began to show, she turned to the funny-looking man for help because she had nowhere else to go. He drove her to a home for unwed mothers in Charleston, gave her some money, and after she delivered, kept an eye on her. But in his heart, he knew he'd have to save her from a lifetime of misery. When she became pregnant again by a different father, that time came. But now that she was dead, he had to decide what to do with her first child. "Honey, stay still," he said. The toddler had frizzy hair, dark watery eyes, and apple-sized cheeks, which pushed up into her eyes. As he laid her on the couch, he lifted her blanket around her head. She sensed the danger and began pressing out tears. To keep her quiet, he reached for a ball-peen hammer and, heaving deeply, did what he was sure God intended him to do. An autopsy would note, quote, "a blunt force injury to the posterior superior aspect of the head and indications of post-mortem destruction of the distal aspects of the lower extremities, feet, and ankles." In other words, he brought the hammer down on her swaddled head until it caved in, then worked his way down her tiny frame. Cradling her in his arms, he brought her to her dead mother and piled them both in a hearse he parked behind the trailer. He loved that car, purple with a crank that ran a siren on top. He'd initially bought it as a joke. Who would believe that an actual murderer would be stupid enough to drive around in a purple hearse? Wrapping the corpses in plastic, he drove across the back roads. The fall's rains had caused the rivers to flood, sending runoff across the tobacco fields and into the tar-colored swamps. He passed those swamps and the fields he played in as a boy. The abandoned shacks where he'd gotten in trouble and been sent to jail, and the clapboard shacks he'd moved in and out of over the years. Finally, he stopped at a sunflower field bordered by a tree line, took out a shovel, and walked past the trees to the black swamp. Digging 2 shallow graves, he kicked the mother in the first and laid the toddler in the second. Then he heaped a layer of sand over each plastic-covered corpse and dirt on top of that. Finally, he broke a branch off a black ash tree and wedged it in the ground to mark the spot, the start of a graveyard that would grow to hold more than a dozen victims, but not the most notorious one. So, dig me a grave, is the story of Gaskins, but it's also my story. It's a story about my interaction with him, and it's a story about how I began in college in the late 60s as sort of an anti-death penalty, liberal, anti-war kind of long-haired kid, and how that transition from that mentality into an aggressive homicide prosecutor. That's part of it. But also about the interaction between Pee Wee and I during the trial. And what is said in the book is sort of the episode that got me thinking, if you will, about the death. Well, I'd already been thinking about, what's the morality of the death penalty? I mean, prosecutors typically don't wrestle with that. I wrestled with it. One day I'm sitting in the courtroom while we're picking a jury. It took 4 weeks to get a jury because, the jurors were asked, you ever heard of Donald Pee Wee Gaskins? Yeah, what do you know about him? Largest serial or mass murder killer in the state. Well, could you put that aside and base your verdict on what you hear in the courtroom? That didn't go so well. Or if you convicted him, would you automatically give him death, or could you consider giving him life? But it took 400 jurors in 4 weeks to get a jury. But while we're sitting there one day at lunch, Gaskins, who the slickest con man I've ever met in my life, had convinced the guards to not have him eat lunch in the holding cell in the basement of the courthouse, but he'd be allowed in the courtroom, which was vacant. There was nobody in there except me. And the guards came up and brought him up to sit at the defense table and eat lunch. And he entertained them, had them laughing and giggling from time to time. But I sat there, he had this high voice, and he said, I could hear it as if it were yesterday. Dick. I said, what do you want, Pee Wee? He said, you're a lot like me. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you like killing. I said, no, I don't. He said, well, it looks to me like you like killing me. You're having some fun over there doing this. And I said, no, I'm Pee Wee, I'm trying to see justice is done. And he said, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. It's accurate in the book. But he said, no, he said, you like doing this. And, where I spent most of my life in prison, justice, we think of justice as a hard penis. He said, your view of it depends on whether you're giving it or getting it. And I just brushed him off and said, okay, Pee Wee, finish your lunch. But what he was trying to do was get into my head about whether I was a killer like him, whether I enjoyed this process. And he did get in my head a little bit. And I did think about that. And I thought about it when I was writing the book 30-something years later. But he was one of the most heartless, vicious, conniving. I mean, he had this veneer of friendliness that just underneath that was a guy that would take a ball-peen hammer to a 2-year-old baby and kill it. Hard to believe. If you'd met him, you wouldn't believe it. But he also was the beneficiary of, he was originally tried and sentenced in 1975 on 2 murders and got the death penalty. The United States Supreme Court came down with a case called Furman versus Georgia, which found not only our death penalty statute, but 40 others around the country unconstitutional. And so when he was threatened with a retrial, he gave a confession, almost a 350-page transcript confession of the 13 murders he had committed so far. Although later on he would claim he committed hundreds, but at that point, 13 of them, including the 2-year-old and her mother. So I think it's important to understand this book is, again, not just about Gaskins, although a lot of it is. It's about me, and it's about a tremendous job that was done by law enforcement in the 70s on the initial, on the initial crimes. And again, excuse me, I've got allergies here. On the additional crimes involving the killing of Rudolph Tyner on death row. So having said that, let me digress for just a minute and talk about an episode an episode that happened in 1991. Gaskins was sentenced the electric chair in my trial. And it took several years from 1983 to 91 for it to come to pass. About 2 weeks before his execution, he summons his son, little Donnie, who was probably 17 or 18 at the time, to see him on death row. And he asked Donnie to kidnap my daughter, Kate, who was 4 years old at the time, and hold her hostage and call me and have him brought up to the courthouse to meet with me, to give information about other murders. And what's really weird about that is he knew if he could get in my office alone, I had a private entrance he could escape from. I don't know how he knew that, but he told his son to tell me if I didn't do that he was going to kill my daughter, put her in a trunk, hold her. If he won't do it, kill her. Well, little Donnie went to a friend of his to try to recruit him to help. That friend immediately went to the sheriff of Florence County, a guy named Billy Barnes, who immediately picked up Donnie and his friend. But we didn't know who else he talked to, and he had sort of a Manson-esque family, if you will, people out there, and a woman named Suzanne Longlegs Kipper, who was a co-defendant of his on murdering her boyfriend. She paid him $1,000 to do it, and they were lovers. She'd escaped, so she was out on the street somewhere. So we lived with SLED agents, state law enforcement agents, for 2 weeks, with my 4-year-old daughter being taken to daycare or taken to preschool by guys with machine guns. It was a terrifying, horrible experience until he was executed in 1991. Now, the postscript to that is when he was put in the electric chair, and the electricity was put in him, his hair caught on fire, his eyeballs exploded. It was a horrible death. And Paul will tell you that affected me. I mean, if we're going to have the death penalty, and I believe we should, in rare circumstances, ought to be used for the most horrendous cases, not routinely. And so when we gave the inmate the choice of lethal injection, which seemed to be more humane, or the electric chair, that felt to me to be more humane. And then the drug companies started refusing to sell drugs for executions. So it came back to just the electric chair. I introduced and helped pass the firing squad, which Justice Sotomayor, in an opinion, had indicated she thought was a much more humane way to execute somebody, if you were going to execute somebody. Not that she was in favor of executing anybody. So Gaskins influenced my life, influenced my, even as a senator, influenced decisions I made and the legislation I introduced. The other thing to understand is that perception that Gaskins, he published a book that was published after his death where he claimed to kill 100 people. He enjoyed this reputation of being bigger and badder and the worst killer of all times. Now, he didn't enjoy it when we were picking a jury, and he didn't enjoy it during the trial. The jury only took an hour to convict him and an hour to sentence him to death. By the way, we also arrested and prosecuted Tony Simo, there was no money passed, but I think since Tyner was black, Pee Wee probably did it for free. And he tape recorded it, maybe to blackmail Simo later on, who knows. But Simo was also arrested. But what we found was most people would not have convicted him of murder. He technically was an accessory to murder. So we let him plead a lesser charge. He did 4 or 5 years in the penitentiary, got out, and ultimately killed himself. So, I mean, there's enough tragedy here to go around. The one last thing, and then I'll answer any questions if anybody has any, is this. I am not someone who reads a lot of true crime. Now, since this book has come out, since actually I did the first Murdaugh trial, I understand that there are, I want to say tens of thousands, millions of people out there who are intrigued by true crime. And I've started reading some myself now. Having been a prosecutor, my idea of a good read at night wasn't reading what I've been doing all day long, and as a defense attorney, the same thing. But I find that many of you have a real understanding from reading true crime of what's involved in the investigation, and putting together either a good prosecution or a good defense. And I've gotten some great emails from people recently on the Murdaugh case on their suggestions in terms of evidence and what to look for, and this doesn't make sense. So keep reading it. You'll learn a lot from this. And keep, if you want to email me, it's rah@harpootlianlaw.com. If you have suggestions, if you're a Murdaugh watcher, aficionado, we just had a hearing yesterday dealing with all kinds of evidentiary issues. It's a fascinating case. It's been, when I say it's an intriguing case and satisfying to work on, I don't mean, I enjoy a mother and son being murdered. I enjoy working on making sure that the system works. Okay, do we have any chats, questions?
Okay, sorry, Richard. I had to find the right place here. Paula just asked if you could give us a status on the Murdaugh trial.
Sure. We picked a jury. Let me give you the history. Picked a jury in January of 2003. We tried it for 6 weeks. He was convicted in less than an hour. The jury came back. After the jury came back and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences, we had heard that one of the jurors had indicated that the clerk of court had been saying things to them which would indicate she wanted a guilty verdict. And so we began investigating that, and we took 60, 90 days driving around the back roads of this very rural county on dirt roads. And I mean, I'm not trying to paint a romantic image, but these are roads through swamp, Spanish moss on big oak trees, very, very, very thematic, if you will. And we interviewed all the jurors that would talk to us and developed a record that clerk of court was lobbying the jury to reach a guilty verdict, telling them not to believe us, not to believe him. And further, we interviewed people that worked with her from other clerks of court offices, and she was unabashedly telling them she needed a guilty verdict because she was writing a book, and a guilty verdict would sell more books, and then she could afford to buy a house up on Lake Marion. So
Oh, wow.
she had it's in a Supreme Court decision reversing, giving us a new trial, has all those details in it. And the Supreme Court believed they were true, believed she was a liar, and gave us a new trial, and also constrained the state from doing some of the things they'd done in the first trial in this upcoming trial, which is now scheduled for April 5th of next year. And we've had a series of hearings. This is our second hearing yesterday about the schedule, about evidence. The judge ordered yesterday for us to be able to examine unanalyzed DNA that was found under Maggie's fingernails, and other scientific things that we're going to be looking at. So we're prepping for trial. I can't really talk about the details, but we're getting ready for trial. And the judge has decided we move for a change of venue out of the 4 counties that comprise what's called the 14th Circuit. There are 16 circuits, but the original Colleton County and the counties adjacent to it, including Beaufort, where Hilton Head is, for those of you on the West Coast who want some geographic perspective, will not be tried in that circuit. She hadn't said where, but anywhere is better than there. They're all, hell, there have been 6 documentaries, 2 feature-length movies, a docuseries, 6 books. You go on and on and on. If you're true crime aficionados, you've seen them. And the folks they were filmed down there, and they know the family, and the family is very powerful there for over 100 years, the Murdaugh family. I mean, Alex's father was he was an assistant prosecutor. His father was a prosecutor. His father was a prosecutor, and his father was a prosecutor. For over 100 years, the Murdaugh family has controlled the prosecution in those 4 counties. And we found I mean, of the jurors that were drawn, only 1 in 7 that came in on the first day, the 400 that came in, said they didn't know, it hadn't formed an opinion, it could be fair. And I'm not sure they were being honest. So we're out of there, and the judge will announce where we're going to try it. We're trying it April 5th. And we'll have more hearings in November as evidentiary matters come up and pretrial motions come up. So, and I'm looking forward to trying it again. It's, and I'll give you this sort of inside baseball technical analysis. In a criminal case, unlike a civil case where you take depositions and get discovery of what the other side is going to do in a trial, there are no depositions in a criminal case in South Carolina. I think Florida may be the only state that allows them in very limited way. But here we have virtually every witness is going to testify in April has already testified. Every piece of evidence that they're going to introduce in April, based on what they said yesterday, we already have. So we have the transcript of the first trial. And if for instance, well, I'm not going to talk about specifics, but if somebody in April says B when they testified to A in January of 23, you can say, well, you testified, you can impeach them. That's what depositions are for, is to nail people down as to what their story is. And so that is a advantage that we have that we didn't have in 23. So that's where we're at, as we say in South Carolina. We end a sentence with a preposition, but go ahead.
That's where we're at. Okay. Well, since most of us are writers here, some of these questions are about writing. And Rhoda asks, what's the most important things we can do to make our villains evil, but not a stereotype?
Well, that's a good question because, this book, the events that led to this book ended in 1991. And so we're basically 30 years later that I'm writing a book. Now, I had the benefit of when after he was executed, I was a solicitor DA at that point. Clerk of court came to me and said, we have to hold on to all the exhibits until either the appeal's over in a regular case or in a death penalty case until he's executed. Because if he gets commuted and he gets a new trial, then we need all this. And he said, we're getting ready to throw all this stuff out. Do you want it? Oh, hell yeah. And so I've had in storage for 30 years or 20 years, 25 years, we had a copy of the transcript of his confession to the first 13 crimes. So we talk about in the prelude, his killing the baby and the mama. That's from his statement. We didn't, and the forensics. He did not admit to taking a ball peen hammer to the baby, but clearly a soft-headed ball peen has a rubber head. Hammer was used because there were no cuts, no abrasions, but her skull was fractured, mashed basically, and every other bone in her body broken. But so we could piece it together. We had the autopsies. We had all the files from the 70s. The DA that cut the deal with him, a guy named Kenny Summerford, testified in the trial, and he brought exhibits. So we had all of that. And in terms of in true crime, you'll find, as we did with Pee Wee, here's a guy who committed his first crime at 12. He broke into a next door neighbor's house, and when a little girl was there, he didn't think she was home. He took a axe and hit her in the head, thinking he killed her. She chased her down, and he went off to the Florence School for White Boys. This is the South in the 1940s. And they just basically locked 50 of them in a big room every night. And he, being small and not able to defend himself, was literally raped every night for years. And that I believe shaped him into the killer he became. So, nature, nurture. I'm not sure how you get a Gaskins or a Ted Bundy or a Dahmer or one of these people that kills multiple people. But and we have in the book, we explain his background, how he got to where he got. And again, sure, there's plenty of kids that went through that kind of experience that don't go out and kill 15 people, 14 or 15 people, and but whatever was inside him. Now let me also tell you this, give you this little story. When the book came out, I went to bookstores all over South Carolina and got tremendous reception. But I went to Florence, the owner of an independent bookstore in Florence. I've been to Barnes and Nobles there like after all this, but I went to Florence in downtown bookstore, and this is like 2 weeks before Christmas. Big crowd there, all wanted signed books to give as presents for Christmas. And in 1975, Gaskins' daughter, Shirley Ann Gaskins, basically, again, it's complicated, but she turned her daddy in when one of her friends disappeared. So that started the process to get him prosecuted, convicted, sentenced to death, resentenced to 13 life sentences. But Shirley Ann was the one that turned him in, his daughter. She shows up at the book signing. I go, oh my God, does she have a pistol? But she was very friendly. I'd seen her in '83 when we prosecuted Pee Wee for the Tyner murder. She hadn't changed much. And she came over and spoke to me, and I said, how you doing, Shirley Ann? And she said, oh, I miss my daddy. God, okay. I said, but, do you regret having turned him in? And she said, no, if I hadn't turned him in, he'd still be killing people today. So that's the daughter's love for her father. I love him, but thank God he's not killing anybody else. This is a South Carolina story, and I think those of us who have lived here our entire lives appreciate the nuances of the different parts of the state and how Gaskins could kill these people in plain sight, and no one ever thought that he was involved, even though he's driving a hearse. I mean, it's just it boggles the mind, but got away with it until Shirley Ann turned him in.
Wow. Well, we've got a couple other questions about him. Claire wanted to know if you had full conversations with him and if you had to be careful about how much you interacted with him during the trial process.
Well, he would engage. His lawyer was a guy named Jack Swirling, a college friend of mine. We ended up after the trial going into practice together, but Jack would caution him not to talk to me. But he never would talk about the case. He'd want to know how I was doing or whatever. And I'll tell you, the last time I saw Gaskins, this is a little bizarre too. Jack and I were in practice together, and he was representing a serial killer named Larry Gene Bell, who was kidnapping young blonde girls, raping them, duct taping them, and suffocating them. He did it 3 times. And Jack was representing him. I didn't want anything to do with him. But Jack was on a cruise somewhere, and he got a call from somebody at the Department of Corrections that Larry was decompensating. So Jack asked me to take a video camera, which back in those days was a big sucker, and go down and see him and videotape him so he could show it to a psychiatrist when he got back. So I went to see him, and he was at CCI, Central Correctional Institution, as was Pee Wee. But he was in something called Maximum Detention Retraining Center, MDRC, which is the Hole. And the Hole, if you saw Silence of the Lambs, it's sort of like that, underground, 18-foot ceilings with a band of lights around the top, all the way around the top. That's the only natural light you got. It was 18 feet up. And if you looked at it outside, it looked like a bunker of some sort. There was this protrusion that came out about 1.5 feet surrounded by this razor wire fence. And then there were stairs you went down, very steep stairs. It went down 20 feet, I guess. And they didn't have glass like they do in Silence of the Lambs, but they had these cells, big cells. And I went to see Bell and videotaped him. Bell was talking to either Jesus or an angel. I couldn't get it quite straight, up in the corner and asking me if I saw him. I said, sure, I see him. He's right there. But I got it all on videotape. And I was leaving, and the guard comes over and says, the inmate in the cell next door would like to see you. Well, how does the inmate in the cell next door know I'm even there? But he conned that guard and made him a buddy. And I said, who is it? He said, Gaskins. So I go over there, and they have this solid metal door that's like, you've seen them if you've been to cells or prisons, they've got these bolt-looking things on them. You open that, and then there's a barred door, and they open the door, and there's Pee-wee, and he's standing there, and he says, "Dig, how you doing?" I said, "Great, Pee-wee. How are you?" He said, "Well, just trying to stay busy." And I said, "Well, what have you been up to?" And he had in his hand a drawing in one hand, and indelibly etched in my memory is in the other hand, he had a red pencil, sharpened pencil. And this was a picture of, can't even remember what it was of, but it was crudely drawn, not a work of art, not even a bizarre Picasso looking thing, but it was crudely drawn. And he said, "I've been doing these drawings. What do you think?" I said, "Oh, Pee-wee, that's just great. I mean, that's really, really good." He said, You think so?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm trying to make a little money for Canteen. You think they're worth anything?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely. And you know what? They're going to be worth a lot more real soon." Like, anyway, so I watched his eyes, and they went from soft and friendly to extremely harsh and steel. And I remember thinking there he's probably 10 feet away from me. Could he throw that pencil hard enough to go through the bars and hit me in the eye? And I immediately backed off, and I was just trying to be funny. He didn't think it was funny. And that was the last conversation I had with Gaskins. So yeah, I had conversations with him. But if you're doing true crime, and the previous question was, how do you make them three-dimensional? You just need to study them. And in my case, and I didn't have to just study them, I spent time with them, instances like that. I watched them every day for 6 weeks. I saw him in court hearings. I saw him reacting with Jack. I saw him, get outraged in the courtroom at some of the testimony I brought out, and watch him get angry. And that angry Pee-wee was, when the jury saw that, I knew. I mean, this sort of casual, friendly to everybody guy was not who they saw on some instances in the courtroom. And if I could get that in front of a jury, I knew they'd convict him and sentence him to death, and they did.
Yeah, the eye changing is fantastic. Brenda wants to know if you know what happened to his son.
Well, interestingly enough, I was not keeping up with Donnie, but at that book signing that Shirley Ann showed up at, there was a deputy sheriff there, retired, and another deputy sheriff who was still working at the sheriff's department. And I asked them after Shirley Ann showed up, I said, "What's happened to Donnie? Why isn't he here?" And he said, "Well, he's in jail." So he continued on a life of petty crimes in and out of jail. Nothing major, no murders, no rapes, no armed robberies, but stealing cars. And I mean, and I tell you, last December he was in jail. So I did not particularly want to interact with him.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
Mary Lynn says, do you have a case where you questioned the outcome? For example, you had reasonable doubt and they were convicted and you knew they were guilty, but they were released.
Okay. Have I ever prosecuted or represented?
She didn't say, I guess.
Okay. So look, if we did our best and played within the legal framework and ethical framework, and somebody we prosecuted was acquitted, and I have had that happen, and we knew they were guilty. I mean, that's just the system, and you can't change the system, because I'll tell you real quick what the case was. We had a young woman found dead in her house, been shot in the face with their own .357 Magnum. She's a very attractive woman, and the case got some profile because it turns out that woman, the FBI showed up, and the reason the FBI showed up is she was a woman who had been flown around the country to visit Soviet defectors in safe houses and provide them with entertainment, if you will. So they thought it might have been some sort of Soviet assassination. Well, it turns out that detective at the sheriff's department finds two young African-American men, 17 and 18 years old, who gave a confession that they were breaking in houses and they saw her in the kitchen cooking breakfast and burst in, and she ran down the hall to her room and pulled out her gun. They got it away from her and shot her in the face. And what was interesting was it was tape recorded, which was rare back then. And their individual confessions were tape recorded. Then they had details. For instance, they were asked what was individually, separately, what was being cooked. She's cooking some bacon or ham or whatever it was specifically. And when we burst in, she turned to her left and then turned down a hall, went to the second bedroom on the left, went in a nightstand that was on the right side of the bed, pulled out a big old silver gun, the 357. Only the killers could know that. So I put the detective up and he played the tapes, and I finished developing all the forensic stuff I needed to out of him. And the defense attorney got up and said, "Where are the rest of the tapes?" And I objected, saying, "Your Honor, there's no evidence there are any tapes." And the judge asked the detective, "Are there other tapes?" "Yes, sir." I said, "Oh my God, well, why don't I have them?" And he sent a sheriff's detective down to the department. He brought him back. We played him. And what they were was two things. One, he had both the kids together, and is basically saying, when you broke in, she was cooking ham and eggs, right? And then all the facts were given by the detective to these kids before he individually tape recorded them. Well, the jury acquitted them they were tried separately, but I tried the first one, he was acquitted, and another prosecutor did the second one, he was acquitted. I know for a fact they committed the crime, and they were rearrested a few years later. I mean, the reason I know that is that when they were arrested a few years later, we had at least 2 jailhouse confessions by them saying they got away with killing a white woman up in the Eau Claire section. We knew they did it. And of course, when they got rearrested, they had crimes that they couldn't get life sentences for, but we got them more than adequate substantial sentences. It wouldn't work a deal. But yeah, they were guilty, and they were acquitted. And I've represented many, many people who were guilty, in my mind, and juries acquitted. So here's my point about all that. And I don't represent child molesters and on the criminal side, or insurance companies on the civil side. I equate insurance companies with child molesters, but the point is the system has to work. And that's how I put my head down on the pillow every night and go to sleep. To my knowledge, I've never convicted an innocent person. And I will say this, there is substantial reasonable doubt that Alec Murdaugh killed his wife and son. I can't tell you he didn't do it, but I can tell you that I don't believe the evidence shows he did. But that's a story that'll be played out next April, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. Actually, I think this little comment from Brenda is a good follow-up here, because she says, I'm curious if there's examples where a person acquitted later went on to commit a violent crime. She's asking what the impact emotionally is on the attorneys.
Well, I think you got, and this is why some people criticize me for not having a great bedside manner with my clients. And this is going to sound a little harsh, but it's for me, it is true. I am not the victim's lawyer as a prosecutor. I represent the state of South Carolina, not the victim. I'm not there for vengeance. I'm there to put together ethically, not withhold evidence, not tell witnesses what to say, to put together a case that will convince 12 men and women that the defendant committed the crime with evidence that proves it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, if because of incompetence on part of the police, I hope never my incompetence, I can't think of a single case where I didn't do my best. Although I've seen prosecutors not do their best as a defense attorney, not prepared, didn't anticipate defenses. But I'm not the victim's lawyer. Now, are you empathetic? I had a case where a woman, we determined she had a facility where there were 3 SIDS deaths in 18 months. I mean, the statistical chances of that happening are like 1 in 5 billion. And upon further investigation, clearly she was shaking these babies pursuant to something called Munchausen syndrome. She wanted sympathy. And we had to bring the parents in, and one of the mothers was the head of one of the National SIDS Association, only to tell her, your kid probably didn't die of SIDS, but we got to exhume the bodies and have the eyeballs removed and sent to Britain, where the expert on examining the eyeballs of children who've been shaken to death will analyze the evidence. That was traumatic. I mean, talking to them and watching them cry and I mean, I'm not saying it's not traumatic. I'm just saying my job is not to vindicate or get vengeance for them. My job is to make sure on either side, many of the people I represent are people I personally despise, but that's not the job. John Adams, second president of the United States, represented the soldiers, British soldiers who committed the Boston massacre. 4 were acquitted, 2 were convicted of lesser charges. That is the system. As I pointed out, Abraham Lincoln, if you read Dan Abrams' book, represented murderers, prosecuted case. I mean, that's the job, is to make sure the system works. And that's not, I mean, if you watch many of the lawyers from around the country, they're either on the vengeance trail, they're going to vindicate, the victims. That's not my job. Never has been. And I don't particularly, I mean, look, in terms of making legal decisions, the victim's opinion about something is most of the time irrelevant about what evidence will be believed, what evidence is admissible. And that sounds harsh, but that's how you do the job without turning into a drunk.
Yeah. Valerie just asked, are women or men tougher jurors? Who are more apt to convict?
Well, it depends on what kind of case. I think in civil cases, and I do a large amount of civil work, I find women generally are more willing to listen. I find men more generally make up their mind early on and are unmovable. And on criminal cases, I find women again, and the problem on criminal cases is the technicalities, the whole concept of reasonable doubt is difficult for people to consume and affect and make it work. It's a reasonable doubt case. I had a case years ago where I represented a guy who was involved in a drug case, and I'm going to make a very long story short, but they found 5 kilos of cocaine in his hotel room, registered to him with his suitcase, and clearly it was his room. He signed in by him, and they offered him a pretty good deal, like 15 years, and he wouldn't do it. So we went to trial. Couldn't put him on the stand because he had a prior conviction for cocaine, and we were in Aiken County, which is right on the border of Georgia and South Carolina, and the Savannah River nuclear plant, or as we call it here, the bomb plant, is there. And many, many people that live in Aiken County work at the bomb plant, and many, many of them are engineers. So when we picked the jury, I picked these guys that had the little pocket plastic thing with the pens and worked at the bomb plant. And so I argued things like, well, they didn't dust the plastic kilo bags for fingerprints. They didn't check that the signature at the front desk was him, or matched his signature. They didn't get the videotape from the front desk. And I came up with some theory it could have been somebody else. But I said, if you have a reasonable doubt, and of course those engineers went back there and looked at it as an engineering problem. Said, basically, and I told them, if you have a reasonable doubt, oftentimes you go back to the drawing board. Well, they were out 15 minutes and acquitted him. And he looked at me because I hammered him to try to take the plea. He said, "You're not so smart, are you?" So that was appreciation. But my point is, you got to look, men or women. I mean, I think women are more willing to be skeptical about evidence than men are.
Interesting. Okay, I got a couple more. I hope I'm not losing everybody's questions, but Brenda, whoops, I just lost that one. Brenda, where are you? Brenda says she was the one about asking about the emotions, but now she's writing as a writer. Thank you for the insight on how attorney needs to view it, letting the system work. The conundrum it creates for me as a writer is, does that mean it's never okay to have an attorney to feel even a modicum of guilt when an acquitted person goes on to commit violent crimes?
No, I think that should. I mean, you can't be stone cold. That should come up. But then you've got. I mean, what I have to do is remind myself what my role is. But is that the initial response? Absolutely. And if you didn't have some response like that, you wouldn't be a human being. And to
Yeah.
do what we do, you have to judge human beings and what is a natural human being reaction. You've got to have some reaction to it. I'm just saying that shouldn't dictate, you know, your emotional response. I mean, you could lose a big case like the one I did, the woman who was shot in the face, and front page news for 2 weeks that, you know, these folks are acquitted, and you could never go back in a courtroom again. I was trying a case 2 days later. So I pride myself on being able to separate those things, if you will, and not let it affect me long term. And again, there are plenty of folks out there who that would affect in such a way they might not go back in a courtroom, or they might, you know, think they're to blame.
Yeah.
I don't accept that, and that's why
That's
I'm my age and still doing it and having fun doing it.
yeah, that's good fodder for a writer though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think the writer, I mean, I think what you've got to do is, if you're writing, what you see in the public record, what you see in a trial, or what you see in these sterile reports, isn't going to give you some idea of how if you're writing a true crime book, how the prosecutor felt or how the cops felt. You got to go out and interview them, meet them, or talk to people that were around them when it was happening, and flesh out, you know, what kind of person are they? You know, if you're a prosecutor that has one of those little uh, gallows with a noose on it on your desk, you know, I think you're emotionally dead. I'm not sure you've got, no, they're around. Trust me. There's a guy up in North Carolina who prided himself on how many men he'd sent, I
Oh,
think one woman to the electric chair,
yikes.
because he thought of himself as an avenging angel. Now that is a character you can develop in a true crime.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Dover is asking for multiple murders. Would you prosecute a case differently depending on whether the person has a Gaskin type serial killer or someone who had a specific target list to check off?
Well, when you say specific target list, you talk about Bundy, a type that he would kill. Yeah, I mean, it'd be different. Um, it'd
I
be
think you might be asking if if you know it's a serial killer or if it's one person who just wanted to kill one person. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you've got, yes, because the other killings oftentimes are in such a way that you can get them admitted in the one murder. You probably can't. Typically, you can't prosecute multiple murders at the same time unless the MO is exactly the same, and it doesn't work. So you're going to prosecute him for the murder that happened on June 2nd, but what happened in May and April on other murders would be perhaps admissible to show pattern and practice. He wouldn't be on trial for those, but they would be similar acts that you could get in.
Huh.
The individual murder. And let me say this to you. When I first started, there was no DNA, no video cameras everywhere. Fingerprint, if you didn't have a suspect, the fingerprints were useless because they didn't have the AFIS system where you can put it on a national computer and it'll find 10 people whose fingerprints are similar, and then you can narrow it down. We didn't have, or DNA, which they have now, a national system where you can put your DNA in and see if there's anybody that matches it with them. And they're swabbing, everybody they arrest gets swabbed. So they're building a huge database of people who've previously been arrested. So we had none of that. And so it basically boiled down to eyewitness testimony, or occasionally, a confession or statement, or a statement that turned out you can disprove. But today, the jurors expect, the scientific evidence.
Yeah. Joyce has a question. Why did you decide to write this particular book?
Well, it'd been bothering me for 30 years, and I started and stopped and started and stopped. And then a friend of mine, I don't really know Dave Rudolph or not, but Dave Rudolph was a defense attorney up in Chapel Hill. I'd done a couple cases with him. I noticed he came out with a book called, he prosecuted cases and came out with a book, and there was a documentary called The Staircase. I've been wanting to do Pee Wee. He said, well, first of all, you got to get somebody that can write to work with you. You're not a writer, you're a lawyer. And while, you can hack at it and whatever, you need a professional. So I got Shaun Assael. I got an agent, got Shaun Assael involved. And it became just a great partnership between Shaun and I, and how he taught me how to write in a way that is readable and intriguing, and raises a question that keeps for instance, beginning the book with this story about the pregnant woman and the baby being murdered was my idea, because like a good opening statement in a trial, I think you got to get to it at the front end. You can't start with a bunch of platitudes. You got to give them the best shot to keep their attention. And I think it worked, and people said that. And Shaun said, you're becoming a writer because you understand how to get the hook set, how to get them into the book where they don't read the first chapter and say, this is enough. This doesn't have my interest. So once I got Shaun involved, and to be frank with you, COVID came and I had time to do it. There was no law, there was no Senate, there was nothing else to do. I could spend some time on it.
Yeah, Brenda just said, get right at it and keep their attention. Yeah, it's a good reminder for all of us writing. The other Brenda, there's two Brendas, apparently, at least two. She was saying, what was the most surprising thing you saw or heard when dealing with Gaskins?
Well, I think that what I'd felt and discovered was that Gaskins sometimes could not keep that facade up. And again, I think that was critical. And this is in the book again. There was a guy named James Brown who was Pee Wee's best friend. He was, when I met him, he had hair down to his waist. And I remember this is in the 80s when they really didn't have control of the institutions. The inmates ran the asylum. He had hair down to his waist, a beard. He looked like Robinson Crusoe, thin guy, serving 2 life sentences. One afternoon, 2 women, Jehovah's Witnesses, came to his house while I was watching a football game. They insisted on coming in, sat down, continued to talk while he was trying to watch football. He went back in his bedroom, got a .38, came back, shot both of them in the head, and
Wow.
then had sex with their dead bodies. Pee Wee's best friend. James Brown was also, because Pee Wee got to pick the trustees, the guy that delivered the food to death row. And so he was the guy that delivered the bomb that Pee Wee had made that blew Tyner's head off, and also the poison previously put in his food to try to kill him. So he became a key witness, and for about 6 weeks, and he had the IQ of a peanut. I mean, he was really maybe the dumbest guy I've ever met in my life. All he had to testify to was, Pee Wee gave me the bomb, or the device, didn't know it was a bomb. And he told me to give it to Tyner, and I gave it to Tyner. That's all he had to testify to. And we rehearsed it for 6 weeks, and he finally got it down. Every Saturday, I'd have him brought up the courthouse, put him on the witness stand, get him comfortable with the courtroom. And I brought him a McDonald's quarter pounder with cheese every week. That was sort of the reward for performing like a barking seal. But the morning of his testimony, and again, by this time we're 5 weeks into the trial, it took 4 weeks to get a jury. We're in a tiny little, and by the way, after Gaskins, he had being the building man for CB2, he had pliers and soldering iron and wire and speakers and whatever he wanted because he's worked on the electrical system. And that's what he used to build the bomb. They, at this point, would not let, and I had, to make Brown more presentable, he let me get the woman that cut my hair come in and cut his hair and shave his beard. And he looked human again. And I got him a 3-piece suit. And I mean, he was very presentable. But they wouldn't let him have a safety razor to shave. So he's in the small bathroom in the solicitor's office, the prosecutor's office, probably 6 feet by 6 feet. And I'm sitting on the toilet going over it with one more time while he's shaving. And he starts crying. I mean, like boohooing. And I go, oh God, I've locked myself in a small room with a homicidal maniac, and can he hurt me with that razor? And I said, James, what's the problem? He said, oh, I lied to you. I said, oh God, you're going to testify in 10 minutes. What'd you lie to me about? He said, well, I told you Pee Wee and I were friends. And I said, well, yeah, everybody said you were thick as thieves. He said, well, we were more than that. I said, what are you talking about? I said, we were lovers. I said, oh God, well, that's okay. It shouldn't come up. He said, well, my mama's out there from Tennessee. I don't want her to hear all that. Don't worry, dry your eyes. Let's go in there. And he testified like a champ. But I saw Pee Wee over there talking to Jack, and I knew that Jack was getting ready to get up in cross-examination and accuse him of telling everybody, or accuse him of being a discarded lover or something. So I had to ask him. I said, now, James, and by the way, Swirling was 6'7", weighed 420 pounds. Pee Wee was 5'1" and weighed 110, sopping wet. So they were a strange looking couple over there. But I said to James, James, you testified you were friends. And he said, yeah. I said, now you were more than friends, weren't you? And his eyes got so big and he looked back at his mom. I sort of felt bad about it. But again, he is a homicidal maniac. And he said, yes. I said, what was your relationship? And he said, very soft. We couldn't hear it. We were lovers. And I said, now say it louder. And he said, we were lovers. Now, Swirling explodes all 420 pounds of him out of a chair. Pee Wee's got a hold of his coat tail. And Jack is lumbering towards the bench with Pee Wee being dragged behind him, screaming, objection, objection. And then Pee Wee yells. The jury heard it. The judge heard it. The audience heard it. Jack, ask him who was on top. Okay? Okay? Now, in Pee Wee's mind, the most important thing was people understood that he was the guy, that he was on top, that he was in control. And I'm standing right next to the jury rail looking at the jury. And when I heard him say that, and I watched them, their eyes got big and they were horrified. So by getting him to actually lose it in front of the jury, I think was key to getting not the conviction, but the death penalty.
Wow. Yeah, that would have been entertaining at least. Yeah. Harriet wants to know if you have an opinion, why do some serial killers admit their crimes and others maintain their innocence?
Well, Pee Wee didn't admit to this. He actually argued to the jury he didn't do it. So Pee Wee, I mean, some of them think they're so much smarter than we are, and Pee Wee did. And he was very good at getting away with murders in the past. But for these tapes, he never would have been accused of this murder or convicted. So some of them just think they're smarter than we are. A Bundy, for instance, thinks he's smart. I don't know that a John Wayne Gacy ever thought he was smart enough, or a Dahmer. But again, I think it depends on their view of their point. I mean, if they do it knowing and they plan it in such a way they can get away with it, they think they're smarter than we are.
Okay, got one from Rick, who wants to know if you can say anything about Hunter Biden. Thank you, Rick.
So I represent Hunter Biden. Now, first of all, the Biden family, Joe Biden's been my friend for 30 years. I met him when he was a senator, and he's been just the kindest, nicest guy to me. He, as president, appointed my wife ambassador to Slovenia, close family friend, good friend. And, um, during the difficult times of Hunter and his addiction and all of that, the right-wing people um, went absolutely, including the president of the United States, vilified him in just horrible ways. I knew Hunter. I knew his brother Bo really well. I knew Hunter not as well, but I knew he obviously had some issues. And Hunter had sued a guy named Byrne, who was a big MAGA guy, for accusing him of trying to work a deal with the Iranians to get $8 billion released by his father in exchange for an $800 million payment, which was totally false. And a judge has found in LA, a federal judge, very good federal judge named Wilson, that none of that was true. And so I took over the case probably 2 years ago, and we went through the judge ruled that this Byrne guy defaulted and had a judge conduct a trial, and he gave us $1.7 million. I mean, I think Hunter, and I've been around him a lot, is obviously an addict, but he is off alcohol, drugs. If you've watched his ongoing commentary, it's, I think, extremely accurate. I agree with it. And I know he was put through hell, and his father has been put through hell because of him. And, again, I don't have to be in love with him to represent him. I thought he had a good case, and it turned out to be a $1.7 million case, which is good.
Yeah, pretty good. Greg asked, can you expand on your current beliefs about the death penalty and how you evolved from that 17-year-old liberal to your current view?
Well, I think, you go through law school and you quit smoking dope and cut your hair and go to work for a prosecutor. And I remember going to my first murder scene, and I believed I needed to understand every crime. If it was a burglary, I try to, go to the house and see how they came in or whatever, because I'm going to have to explain this to a jury. And back then, the photography sucked. There was no digital. They had to develop film, and oftentimes it was overdeveloped or underdeveloped. So you need to have an image in your mind where you can convert that into an image you can describe to a jury. So I went to virtually every kind of scene, but my first murder scene was out in the country in a farmhouse, and you go in the front door. I mean, I can see it as yesterday, and I had a porch out front. It was one story. You walk in this hall, and there's a dining room down at the end of the hall, and a living room over to the side. And in the dining room, there's a figure on the floor, hands tied behind their back, pillowcase over his head, bullet hole in the back of his head. And you can see it through the pillowcase, and blood all over the floor. In the front room, which would have been the living room, there was marijuana residue up about 3 feet surrounding the wall. So somebody had come in, stolen the marijuana, and I would suspect he recognized the voice of whoever was there, and they decided to kill him so there'd be no witnesses. Now, that case was not solved for 30 years, but that image of this executed, hands behind his back, bothered me. And as a postscript to that, probably 5 years ago, I talked to the sheriff here, and they were beginning to go through all their old cases. And if there was any evidence that could be examined for DNA, they did it. And there were cigarette butts, they were cools on the floor. And of course, back then, unless there was a fingerprint, they didn't have the ability to fingerprint a cigarette. I mean, local folks didn't. So they just bagged it up and came back 5 or 6 years ago. And let me go back off just a little bit. I represented a biker. I was appointed to represent a biker named two-time Tony Spodnik, along with his good buddy, righteous Richard Shira. Took a baseball bat while they're on PCP to one of their other biker friends, took a baseball bat to a skull. Guy's name was Anvil Head Bulwer, if you believe that, and caved
Wow.
his skull in, then cut his head, his hands, and all body parts and buried it around the yard. They got caught and convicted. But 5 years ago, they got the DNA off that cigarette butt and identified the killer as Anvil Head Bulwer. So he'd had his head caved in 20 years earlier by his PCP raging fellow bikers. So I mean, small town, I guess.
Well, Paula asks, how would you advise writers to write about high-profile trial cases? But before you answer, I just got to say those names were phenomenal. They just sound like we made those up. Those are great names.
No, those are the real guys, and the great thing about Two-Time Tony, and he was tattooed all over his body. He never ever whined, never ever got mad. We tried, he got convicted, and back then life carried a mandatory minimum service of only 10 years. So he served, I think, 15 or 20 and got out. But when the guilty verdict came in, he looked at me. He said, "You did a great job." He said, and I'll never forget. He said, "We played a rough game and we lost." I thought that was
Oh,
a hell of a philosophy. Two-Time Tony.
yeah.
So anyway, yeah, great names. The bikers, I've represented them, I've prosecuted them. They're an interesting crowd.
So Paula's question about how you would recommend, let me find it again, how you would recommend to writers writing high-profile trial cases.
Well, I think you do this if you can do it. Obviously, if it's a televised trial, you do it. Everybody's doing it on Murdoch watching it. If it's not televised, you need to go to the courtroom and watch the defendant and the prosecutor and the defense attorney and their body language. So look and see how they react to each other, and how that is what's the body language between the defendant and the defense attorney? Is it tense, awkward? What's the body language between the prosecutor and his cops? So I
Yeah.
mean, you got to see it and go talk to them. I'm writing a book. I want to know about this. Most of these cops, they want to talk to people. They want to be in a book after the case is over.
Yeah, after the. Okay, I think I've covered most of the questions. If I didn't, I apologize to everybody that's on the chat. Rick, do you want to come back in? Oh, wait, got one more.
Okay.
Susan says, are you in favor of cameras in the courtroom during a high-profile case?
Yeah, I do. I am in favor of it. And I tried the first case that was televised in South Carolina 30 years ago as a prosecutor. I think it keeps everybody, including the judge, honest, in the sense of, I've seen stuff happen in a courtroom when, nobody's watching, that witnesses or prosecutors, defense attorneys, witnesses, and the judge would never want anybody ever to see. Now, you can read a transcript, but the transcript doesn't demonstrate,
Oh,
the
good point.
tone or the cadence or the anger. You know, Gaskins was not televised. Jack Sroing, as I point out, my good friend, Jewish guy. And the judge was a guy named Dan Laney, who was renowned for his temper, renowned. And Sroing kept making these objections. And Laney finally just got so red-faced, he lost it. And he said, "Do I have to tell you in Hebrew?" Now, that is not in the transcript. Somehow the court reporter, who is his employee, forgot to put it in there. But I was there. I heard it. If it had been televised, that never would have happened.
I like how they forgot.
Yes.
Greg says, you mentioned the video surprise in your case earlier. Other than that, what are some of the biggest surprises you've encountered in a trial?
Oh my God. Well, I'm hopefully the surprises I've encountered are ones I brought about. And so,
Good way to
I
put
mean,
it.
if I've done my work, I don't get surprised very, very often. I mean, incompetent police work is something you can uncover if you work hard enough preparing the case. Um, Oftentimes, I'm the guy with the surprises because I understand, um, what I took a pro bono murder case. It was a 16-year-old was charged with murder. And I mean, make a very long story short, they allege he got in an argument with a guy up at a convenience store on one night. He was homeless. He'd run away from a foster home. And he got in a dispute with this guy. And then the next night followed him and shot and killed him. And they had the videotape from the convenience store, but it didn't show him following him. It just shows they were having it wasn't even an argument, probably 30 minutes before the shooting. And I went out as soon as I got hired, and it was soon after he was arrested, and saw that next door was a laundromat that had a camera that would show who followed him, who did it, whatever. Now, here's the decision. The decision is, do you go in and get a copy of that or not? And you may say, why wouldn't you want it? Well, why should I be building if I find this guy has a video of my client following him, then I think that he has an obligation, and I may have an obligation to make it available to the prosecution. So I said, how long do you keep the videos? He said 30 days. So the trial came up much later than that. And I put him on the stand. I asked the cop, well, this is the only video. Yes, sir. There were no other videos. And I pulled out a photo and said, you see the laundromat right here? Isn't that a camera? Well, I never noticed that before. And was there video there? And we put the guy on the stand saying, yeah, there was the video was 30 days. So I surprised them with the fact they had totally ignored this opportunity to nail down who followed him. Reasonable doubt, the kid was acquitted. So, I mean, I just think it's, the defense attorney wants to surprise him. And we'll probably have some surprises in this next trial in Murdaugh.
Wow. Okay. Rick, you're
Yes, I'm
coming
here.
back here.
Well, this
Thank
has
you.
just been wonderful. I just got to ask this question: are you in the California bar? And if so, can I get your business card?
Well, no, I was admitted what they call pro hoc vici for that case only on Biden. I do cases around the country, but typically don't do them frequently enough to be required to be a member of the bar. I get a local lawyer to sponsor me. In the Biden case, a guy named Brian Sullivan and Zach Hansen are with a firm in LA, and they sponsored me.
Good. Well, good to know I can get you. Well, listen, this was just an absolutely wonderful. We could go on for another 3 hours, but you've got to get your rest because I think you're going to court next week, right? So,
back in court next week on a different case.
Yeah.
And people need to understand, Murdaugh's not my only case. I've got other criminal cases and some great civil cases. You don't make money on criminal cases, rarely. I mean, you don't have Murdaugh, for instance, they seized every penny he had on his financial crimes guilty plea. So we're doing this ourselves.
Yeah. Well, we thank you, and Paula, thank you. This has just been absolutely wonderful, and I hope we can get back here again, Richard. This was just been absolutely, your stories are just great, and I'm sure you got a lot more, and we just want to hear them all sometime. So,
well, I appreciate it, and thank you for having me, Paula. Thank you for connecting me up. Paula's a superstar here, and she's the legislature couldn't operate without her. She is the person that tells you, nah, that's not going to work. And she doesn't hesitate.
She does that in board meetings too.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much, and everybody, and have a great weekend. And we will see you again. This will be it'll be on videotape, and we'll have it on videotape. Listen to me. It'll be recorded, and we'll have it on our YouTube channel in about a week. So if you missed anything or you want to check it again, it'll be online. And check the rap sheet and our website for all the new upcoming events, and we will see you at the next meeting.